Let me also join Leslie and Graham in welcoming you to this year's conference. We've got an awful lot to talk about and lots of ground to cover. I hope by now you've all downloaded the new conference app. It gives you access and information about what's going on in the conference, and we'll use it later on to feed back on each of the sessions. You can also use it to network with delegates, and you can download the sessions that you want to attend, which I'm sure is all of them, to your phone's calendar. And it also links you to the Twitter feed. And I noticed that lots of you have been tweeting away already, and we're already trending, as young people, I believe, call it. But you can also use it to get points on the conference app through the conference game. The winner will pick up a Fitbit, so we can all see just how much longer we're going to live by doing more exercise. And that might help you also put to right some of the excesses of the week, especially if you're at Bongo Bingo, did you call it, Graham? The mind boggles. But you're also going to need it for some of the conference questions and questions and polls that we're going to be running. And we're going to be running one of them at the end of this session, or towards the end of this session, so please do open the app if you've not done it already. But no matter whatever our conference challenge teams come up with to encourage workplace saving, the fact remains, as Graham said very clearly, state pensions are going to remain a very, very big part of everyone's retirement income. And for those millennials, of course, that we just saw, for them, when they retire, when they get their state pension, will be perhaps further away. So we're now joined by John Cridland, who is leading the government's review of state pension ages. It's looking at longevity, it's looking at how wider changes in society impact the state pension and how the state pension age can be made more sustainable. So, as I'm sure you all saw last week, John's just published the interim report of his review, and he's here to tell us all about it. John, you're very welcome.
Well, thanks, Joanne. It's a pleasure to be here. In March, I was asked to review the future of state pension age arrangements and make recommendations to the Secretary of State. What is a suitable age in the future? Does a universal state pension age, increasing in line with longevity improvements, best support affordability, fairness, and fuller working lives? And ably supported by an expert team of DWP colleagues, I'm halfway along my journey to the review conclusions in March of next year. And as you say, Joanne, on Thursday of last week, we published our interim report. And it got some interesting reactions. A breath of fresh air, said the Pensioners Forum. One commentator said it was an underwhelming report. I hope he's not in the audience because I'm going to quote what he said. Cridland's report is underwhelming, he said, because I've read the interim report and I couldn't find what's going to be in the final report. Well spotted. For the avoidance of any doubt, if any of you, having listened to me for the next 10 minutes, think you know what I'm going to recommend to the Secretary of State, you haven't understood a word I've said. Because I'm at the halfway point. I'm clear what the evidence is telling me. I'm clear what the questions are that need answering, but I haven't decided what the answers are. There are 26 questions in the interim report, open for 12 weeks of public consultation, which I hope you'll take advantage of. But there are just 7 of those questions that I'd like to share with you today, because they are, I think, in many ways, the most important questions, and they're the questions which I think you can help me with particularly. So the first of those questions wouldn't have occurred to me 6 months ago, and it's this. It's about affordability. Considering the main drivers of state pension expenditure, which ones are most important if there's a trade-off? Maintaining access to the state pension, allowing for a generous increase annually, or making the full state pension accessible to more people. Question number 2. Is the state pension age the best tool to maintain a steady GDP proportion for pension benefits? The key affordability question for our colleagues in the Treasury. And question number 3, which also relates to these key questions. How can we best take into account the sensitivity of the life expectancy projections when considering an appropriate state pension age for the future? But I'd then like to discuss with you 3 questions that have more to do with fairness and more to do with fuller working lives. And the first of those is to ask you about whether healthy life expectancy alongside life expectancy are improving swiftly enough for the majority of the population. The second is to look at how we can best take into account the impact of caring responsibilities in later life within the decade prior to the state pension age. And finally, I'd like to look at the question of the interrelationship of the state pension age with your world, and particularly with the world of occupational pension schemes. How do the two interrelate, and what are the issues that we might think in the first instance are issues for the private sector, not for the state pension, but which a state pension age review needs to take into account? Now, if I may, just a few words on each. So I asked you 3 questions which were connected around affordability. Trade-offs between different factors which affect affordability, the best tools to maintain affordability, and the sensitivity from our scientific experts of longevity projections, which then obviously affect public policy on fiscal sustainability. And I guess one thing I've learned since March is that the exam question I thought I was being asked to answer has become a rather different one. Surely, for the state pension to be affordable, if we have the blessing on average of living longer, then we need to work longer. It's a fairly logical consequence. But actually, I've concluded that isn't the right exam question. There's a triangulation here, which is rather more complicated. You can't look at when the state pension age needs to be set without also thinking what your policy is on the value of the state pension. Let me just explain that. Today, the state pension, leaving aside other pensioner benefits, costs the country, costs the exchequer, 5.5% of GDP. By 2045, the state pension will be costing society 7.1% of GDP. Because instead of having 305 pensioners for every 1,000 workers, by the mid-2040s, we'll have 357 pensioners for every 1,000 workers. But if the triple lock continues over those nearly 30 years, then of that 7.1% of GDP, 0.5% will be directly a consequence of the triple lock's impact of indexing the state pension's value higher than either earnings or inflation. At least I wrote that speech before the most recent fall in the pound and its impact on inflation. But I think it's still broadly true. So one trade-off is whether we want to prioritize access to the pension against value for the pension. Essentially, I think the public looking forward have a choice. if they want to maintain earlier access, let's say at 67, to the state pension, you can't at the same time sustain increasing the value of the state pension higher than earnings in the economy. If you believe that continuing to rebuild the value of the state pension is the priority, then to achieve affordability, you might have to bite the bullet on a state pension age going higher more quickly. All these fiscal judgments depend on my other question. They depend on longevity projections, which we know are sensitive. Current legislation has the state pension age increasing to 68 by 2046. The Office of Budget Responsibility in 2015, using 2012 demographics, projected that an increase to 68 would need to be by 2036, a whole decade earlier. But this year, using the latest demography projections for 2014, that increase has moved back from 2036 to 2041 to 42. So within a relatively short period for me to consider, it's bouncing around. And where will it go next? I've got to reach a judgment on how to allow for that sensitivity. So let's move from the macro rather more to the micro. My second cluster of questions related to fuller working lives. The question of the most impacted groups. The question of healthy life longevity. The question of carers. And for me, the fundamental question of how realistic it is to expect most of our fellow citizens to continue to play an active role in the labour market longer. Now here, actually, the more I've looked at the evidence, the more I am encouraged by the figures. If you went out on the street here in Liverpool and said to people, as in a sense you did with that most recent film I was just watching, instead of asking them the question, how much do you think you need to save, if you said to them, how long do you think you can work, I think the presumption would be that for many people in Liverpool, working into their late 60s is not a realistic option. And often people would say, too many of us won't have healthy longevity. Actually, the evidence is more encouraging here. The trajectory for healthy longevity appears to be moving along the same trajectory in parallel to the trajectory for longevity. At 65 today, a man has 21 more years to live on average. In 1948, it was 12. In 2045, it will be 25. But today, it's just over 20 years. And almost half of that, certainly 9 years, is likely to be spent in good health. So the options for later working should be available. But that bald statistic masks a lot of dispersion and diversity. A number of submissions, particularly that from the TUC, have already pointed out to me that whilst public policy is trying to focus on people working into their late 60s, we still as a country face the challenge of encouraging people and facilitating and enabling people to keep working in their 50s. There is significant leakage in the early 50s, and ill health is often the reason why people fall out of the labour market. In that respect, I spent an interesting day yesterday with my DWP colleagues at an unemployment centre in Blackpool, looking at their individual clients and the case studies of the life histories of those people. And Blackpool, we know, is a very challenged area because it has some of the poorer demographic figures on most spectrums. And there you find people who are struggling to maintain their employability, in part because of the effects of poor health. But it goes beyond poor health, doesn't it? I'm very concerned to understand, and I ask you, those of you who are employers in the room, to think about this not as a pensions expert, but from your experience of the work colleagues you have. I'm interested in the debate about burnout. At what point do people find it difficult to continue doing a role that they've been doing for 30 or 40 years? We used to think of this in heavy industry terms. If you go to a car factory here in the Northwest, you'll see production lines with teams where you rarely see somebody over the age of 60. It's almost self-selecting that people don't find that work easy to do. The pace of activity, the physical constraints, much beyond 60. But I think it goes well beyond traditional industrial and manual work. I think it's just as relevant a question, burnout, to ask about our lives as professional knowledge workers. You ask a teacher who's been doing classroom teaching for 40 years whether they think in their late 60s they'll be able to motivate and control a classroom of 30 teenage kids in a standard British school, and you'll find the same response, that for some, not all, it becomes more difficult. Now, this doesn't mean that people can't work longer, if that's the response we need to get their state pension. But it does mean we need to be far more intelligent and innovative about smoothing the transition from the form of work that worked for them in middle life to different forms of activity which suit them better in later life. And we need to be more joined up in public policy. So another part of government at the moment has an objective of having 3 million apprenticeships in the British economy, something most of us would share. But if you're going to have 3 million apprentices, you're going to need something pretty close to 3 million trainers, what the Germans would call Meisters. So perhaps some of those 65-year-old workers in a car factory or 65-year-old teachers in a classroom can apply their skills to training rather than necessarily to production. And indeed, the evidence of people working over the age of 65 is also quite encouraging, but needs intelligently dissecting. There's about 1.2 million workers over the age of 65 today. In other words, people who have chosen to continue working after they've already got access to the state pension. We don't entirely know why that's happening, because behavioural research doesn't give us all the answers. Sometimes it's driven by cost, by the necessity to earn, so it's financial, and sometimes it's driven by the enjoyment of work or the socialisation of work. What people essentially tell us is that they're not ready to retire, whatever that quite means. But what is clear is that most of those people are not doing the jobs they were doing when they were working before the state pension age came in. And secondly, they're choosing to work part-time. And I think that gives some important signals about how a change to the state pension age isn't some technical actuarial exercise that can be done arithmetically. It's got to have great sensitivity to the needs of the labour market. And the final question I posed in relation to fairness was childcare. Many people address this question, elder care and childcare, forgive me. Many people address this question of the state pension age by thinking about our own experiences today. Last night in Blackpool, we were talking to 15 pensioners about their experiences of retirement. But actually my review, whilst taking full cognizance of the equalisation of the state pension age for women that's happening as we speak, and the imminent changes for men and women in the rest of this decade, is really talking about the period beyond 2028, where public policy is still up for grabs. And in that regard, we're talking about Generation X. This review is almost too late for the baby boomers and too early for the millennials. The people impacted here are probably people in their early 40s today. And in that regard, I need to think about how the labour market will be different in 20 years' time. Now, the reason I tripped over childcare when I meant to say and elder care is because lots of people as grandparents are playing a role while trying to hold down a job today, looking after their children's children, grandparent childcare, because with the cost of childcare, that's become part of the social contract of helping their own children to have full careers. But what we're beginning to see, 20 years' time, I think we will have had an explosion, is people in their 50s and indeed in their 60s looking after people in their 80s and indeed in their 90s. And if people are going to live, men to 90 and women to 93, which is the projection for a baby born today, then it's quite likely that the very people we are asking to work longer to wait for their state pension, many of them are going to have the elder care responsibilities, which are reminiscent of the childcare issues of today. Perhaps having to step out of the labour market for 5 years, see their skills and confidence degrade, but then when an aged parent finally dies, trying to move back into work at the age of 66, with all the challenges that brings. Or the other analogy with childcare, wanting and able to hold down a job, but having to phone the boss to say, I can't come in this morning because my dad's had a fall, the unexpected, the emergency care. I don't think we've got our heads around that as an issue for this group in the labour market that we're asking to wait longer for their state pension. And my very final question, which I won't spend any time on because I just wanted to pose it, was the impact of changes to the state pension age on occupational schemes. There will be people in this room who have trust deeds that say the pension is accessed when the state pension age is accessed. And clearly my macroeconomic questions that I asked earlier relate also to the question of your investment strategies. So thank you for the opportunity to outline perhaps a quarter of what's in the interim report. I hope I've whetted your appetite to go away and read it, particularly if you've been having trouble sleeping, and to address over the next 12 weeks some of those really critical questions, particularly on the interface with the private sector and occupational schemes. We need your help, but actually I look forward to your comments on all of what we've put forward. Thank you very much.